Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. This is my third visit to Cottbus. Every 3 years it seems to be a regular pattern, but I'm very pleased to be here and to give this presentation. I've been asked to talk about heritage, the emergence of a new paradigm. I'm very interested in this question. I'm interested in how knowledge develops, how it progresses, if you like. This is really the field of history and philosophy of science. That's where I'm drawing a lot of my ideas from today. The summer school's theme is constructing heritage, or reconstructing heritage in the light of sustainable development, and today I'm focusing on heritage, the emergence of a new paradigm. Now, a few weeks ago, there was a conference in Sweden that some of you, I guess, were at, and I know Professor Albert was there and spoke about it in her paper last week. I wasn't able to get there because I was in the US in May and Norway in June and here in July and the UK in September, so I just said, well, that's enough. I can't also go to Sweden. It was a great pity for me because I worked very closely with Laura Jane Smith, who was really running that conference, and we're working together on a book called Retheorizing Heritage, and we want to draw out of that conference in Sweden some papers for the book, so in a way I should have been there. However, there's a limit to the amount of travel that you can do from Australia. It really is very exhausting, and as you get older it becomes more exhausting. But I want to talk a little bit about Laura Jane's work and that conference. We also are doing co-editing a series of books that I'll mention further on, and she, as you know, I think is the editor of the International Journal of Heritage Studies. I'm on the editorial board of that, and so I work closely with her. And so I don't want you to misinterpret the kind of critique I'll be making of some of Laura Jane's work. I'm doing this in a sense of camaraderie, and we are good colleagues, and so on. I want particularly to draw attention to the Manifesto, the Gothenburg Manifesto, that was prepared for that conference. What I want to do today is, I hope not going to be too boring for you. I want to look at this notion of the paradigm, where it comes from, and what makes it up, and especially this notion of paradigm shift, because that's, of course, implied in the topic that the title of this presentation that I'm giving, and indeed in the title of the summer school itself. So I want to explore that notion. I think it's a useful way to look at where heritage studies has come from, and where it is now, and where it might move to in the future. And so there are some key questions, that I'll be addressing. Does the notion of paradigm apply to the development of knowledge in the heritage studies field? Is there paradigm unrest in our field? Is it the kind of turbulence that might lead to a paradigm shift? And if not, what's the nature of the knowledge development that's taking place? The sources I'm relying upon are essentially these. And this is why you might all drop off to sleep, and after lunch there's a tendency to do that anyway. I don't have any pictures in my PowerPoint, none at all, because the method I'm using is essentially textual analysis. And for some people that's very dry and off-putting, but I hope you will stay awake and have some questions, and you can liven it up at the end. But these are the key references. Thomas Kuhn, in the field of history and philosophy of science. and his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. As you can see, it's pretty old, 1962. You can see also, despite having a German name, he is in fact an American, an American scientist, scholar. The other two are from a geographer, and as in the introduction, you know I'm a geographer by background. And I guess that background shows through in the way I approach things. I don't go to geography conferences very much these days. I sort of focus on heritage ones, but I think the disciplinary training and the disciplinary outlook is still there. Now, one of the geographers who used to be in Melbourne, my hometown, back in the 60s, in fact, one of the first things I published was a chapter in a book that he edited, is Ron Johnson. He's now in the UK. He's worked a lot in America. And there are a couple of references there that you might find useful, and I will talk about those later on. The rest of it is, largely my observations. I've been working in this field now since, really the late 1960s, so it's quite a long spell. So this is, if you want a methodological term for it, it's really participant observation, because I've been part of it. I'm part of the gentry that moved into the inner part of Melbourne and started, making changes to the environment and becoming interested in heritage and becoming involved in local politics. And then I did my PhD on that topic, on gentrification. And so, I was being self-reflective, looking at what's happening, and, I was a participant in that whole process. So they're the two methods, I guess, textual analysis and participant observation. My paper, I guess it's going to be too long. It's one of my problems, I guess, in talking. Too much to say. There's roughly the paper outline. We'll see if we can get through all of that. Okay, so the concept of paradigm. And this whole interest in, how knowledge progresses or develops became a hot topic in the 1960s because of the publication of Thomas Kuhn's book, which focused on this idea of the paradigm. Now, the notion of paradigm has been challenged quite seriously. And in the scholarly world, in the scientific world, it's not accepted still by everyone. However, it was a very popular idea, and so it's been picked up, and we use it in common ways. I noticed yesterday in the student presentations that quite often the word paradigm, a changed way of looking at things, had come up. It's become part of the popular vocabulary, really. Now, that's not at all what Thomas Kuhn was on about. He was really thinking about science, the way scientific thinking progresses. So he was talking about major revolutions in scientific thinking, like, the Copernican assertion that the Earth was not the centre of the universe, but, just, one of the millions of bits and pieces out in the solar system, or Galileo's ideas about motion. And he was arguing that scientific knowledge doesn't build up in a smooth way, but goes in bursts. Okay, and these bursts he refers to as paradigm shifts. He didn't actually coin that term, but it very quickly got attached to what he was talking about. So you have periods in which new ways of understanding arise and capture the attention of scientists and eventually the allegiance of most of the scientific world. This is a paradigm shift. But he sees that as a revolutionary process. See, whereas other scientists, one of his adversaries was Karl Popper, who argued that knowledge progresses in a smooth way, an evolution rather than a revolution. So that's the essential argument. So interspersed between these periods when a paradigm is in place, you have periods of turbulence or paradigm unrest, when a whole lot of problems seem to be arising and scientists are finding it difficult to explain them using the existing set of ideas. And that unrest builds up until eventually the new paradigm takes place. And then you get back to a kind of stability for a while, which Kuhn calls normal science, that kind of smoothness before you get another period of unrest. Okay, so Kuhn's idea, concept, in a way is a paradigm itself. He brought in a new way of thinking about how scientific knowledge developed. Okay? Now, you could argue, in fact I think I would argue, that we're still in a period of unrest there because Kuhn's idea is not yet accepted as the general way in science. There's still some resistance and debate coming from various sources. But Kuhn's work is important in lots of ways, whether there is, has become generally accepted or not. Because he highlights for us that in science we have a choice between the way we think of things in terms of epistemology. There are different sets of ideas that we can choose among. He says that we have a choice in terms of the disciplinary matrix of accepted generalizations and methods, or methodologies that we might use. And we have a choice also in the exemplar or best practices for tackling specific problems. His work is also important in leading to the view that's, I think, now largely accepted, that scientific truth is not objectively derived, but has a large degree of subjectivity within it. It's determined really by a consensus of scientists. Okay? So there is a kind of subjective element in it. And we have to accept that. And you can see, I think, if you know anything about postmodernism, you can see how this idea gets picked up in that postmodern movement where, you have this emphasis on the many voices and, voices being all largely valid and, equal, whether it's pop culture or high culture or whatever. Okay, so let's look just briefly at human geography, which is the branch of geography I belong to. I should skip on, hang on. There we go. Human geography. And the work of Ron Johnson and others. You can see in this discipline a series of periods, coming from the 1960s, we don't need to go back further than that, where some sets of new ideas started to emerge. The first one is back in the 1960s when I was a student. We had this quantification revolution. I didn't particularly like it, and I thought, oh, well, this is just a bandwagon. I'll not get onto the bandwagon and wait for it to pass. And actually I was right, because it didn't catch on. It didn't actually become a paradigm. But back in the 1960s, there were many geographers arguing that this is the way to go. This is the future of geography. And they really got onto that bandwagon. You can see, just an example there by Peter Haggard and Richard Chorley, a chapter in a book. The book itself is, this kind of quantified approach, models in geography. Everything was being reduced to a kind of statistical model of some kind, and diagrams. But they're chapters called Models, Paradigms, and the New Geography. Okay, well, that didn't really catch on, partly because some of the key writers, like David Harvey, not the current David Harvey, but another David Harvey, who was also British, and at the University of Bristol, who in the 1960s was part of this paradigm, if you like, and published a book called Explanation in Geography in 1968. And he's written about the experience of 1968 for him because, as you probably know, 1968 was a very turbulent year. You know, the events of 1968 in Paris and Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement in the US and so on. I mean, it was a very interesting but difficult year in lots of ways. Now, he sent off this thing that was all about models and explanations in that form, and found himself suddenly caught up in this year, 1968, and he just felt that the kind of neutral sort of work that he was publishing was suddenly an embarrassment for him, and he turned around and, you know, he'd become disenchanted with socialism in Great Britain, and he found himself a job in the US. It was worse there because, you know, he found himself in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement, and so he switched away from that and moved into another way of looking at geography, which was known as the radical geography movement, where you start picking up a completely different set of key issues of gender and race and conflict and post-colonialism and so on. Okay? And then for a while there were a number of geographers, Richard Peat and so on, who thought that this was the way of the future. But then, you know, by the end of the 70s, really, the steam was lost in that movement and people moved away again from that. Chris Handit, another British geographer here, has commented in the 1980s then that there was a move to really reject, to throw out all that quantitative stuff, and they, you know, criticised it being, you know, too empiricist and too descriptive and so on. And there was a movement into qualitative techniques. He says that it's pretty blindly done by many geographers. They didn't quite know why they were doing it, but that's what everybody else was doing it. So there's that kind of bandwagon effect. Okay, so he says, you know, arguably this methodological development has been characterised by a shift from much mindless quantification and measurement to an unquestioning use of qualitative techniques. So you can see again that, you know, Handit's already starting to see there are some problems in this, and that kind of turbulence, then that kind of unrest will lead on to another movement. Okay, now let's try and apply some of that to what's been happening in heritage studies. And I'm going to look particularly at what's been happening in the universities and what's been happening in practice, in professional practice, and then we'll come back to look at critical heritage studies and Gothenburg and the Manifesto. Okay, well, the heritage profession, as I guess you know, and I'm not going to dwell on this, but, you know, just to give a little snapshot of where we've been coming from. You've got the early foundations in things like the Venice Charter and the 1972 Convention, and before we got onto the World Heritage List, there was another series of programs called International Campaigns for the Protection or the Safeguarding of the Heritage of Mankind, as they used to say in those days. You know, the early projects on Borobudur and the Nubian statues and the plaza in Cuba and so on. These run out of the Division of Cultural Heritage. This is before the World Heritage Committee established, or before UNESCO established the World Heritage Centre. You know, that's something that didn't happen until the 1990s. Okay, but there was, you know, a long period before that when these projects were run out of the Division of Cultural Heritage on a different campus of UNESCO in Paris. I'm sure you know all of this. Parallel to that, happening at the global level, of course, most states around the world were setting up in this period, you know, I'm talking about the 1960s and 70s, their own national systems. Some systems go back quite a long way. I mean, if you're talking about France, you can go back to into the 1840s, really, with the establishment of the inspectors in France. But in France, one of the key events was in 1962 when they introduced the Loi Marot. Marot was a bit of a villain, really. I know him because I do a lot of work in Indochina, in Vietnam and Cambodia, and he was actually out there stealing statues from the temples and selling them off. He ended up in jail in Saigon at one period because of this looting activity. Lo and behold, in the 1960s, here he comes again, the de Gaulle government, and he becomes the Minister for Culture, and was backing this law that started to move from the earlier focus on just monuments and archaeological sites to talk about whole areas, the Marais area in particular in Paris. These are the secteurs sauvegardés, an important step. At the same time, the British were starting to move on this. The town, the Planning Act of 1968, the US about the same time, Australia in the 1970s, and so on. So you've got a global thing, but also a national, and of course they play off each other, perhaps not as much as they might. In the early days, much of this work was seen as technical. Heritage was really a technical matter. Okay, and the kinds of disciplines involved were architectural history and engineering and conservation architects and archaeologists. It was still largely this monuments and sites approach. Heritage was not really seen as a political matter, whereas you're dealing with scarce resources. We define politics, at its most basic level, being, the contest over scarce resources. So, this is essentially about politics, and rights to own and control these resources and regulate them. At this stage, heritage was not seen particularly as a social matter either, although along comes the Borough Charter in 1979, where it starts to pick up a different kind of approach, because, of course, Australia needed and still needs to deal with a multicultural society, an immigrant society, with an indigenous population. Okay, so you can't simply operate in this technical way that the Venice Charter, for instance, does. So the Borough Charter is in addition to the Venice Charter. It doesn't replace it, it adds some other things to the Venice Charter. Now, at the same time, we start to get the emergence of early forms of heritage studies in the universities. In the 1970s and 1980s, there were not many places you could go to for this kind of training. There was ICROM in Rome, it's still running, it's gone back to running the sorts of programs it ran earlier on. But in the 1990s, there was a while when it sort of abandoned a lot of those early ideas of running courses in Rome and so on. And there was a period when they, under one particular director, they saw heritage as being largely about management, rather than looking after the materials and so on. So it's gone back to being a much more balanced kind of approach. There was a course at York under Derek Lindstrom in an architectural school, which was a fairly typical place in the United States, the same, very typical location for heritage, early heritage studies, to be in architecture. Okay, that's... Training, as I've said there, was disciplinary still and focused, rather than being interdisciplinary or, to use the term we bandy about quite a lot these days, holistic. Okay. Now, over the last 10 to 15 years, you've seen a new generation of programs appearing, like the one at my university, which started teaching in the year 2000, like the one here that started teaching in 2001, 99. Okay, where we're trying to be holistic, okay, where we bring in people from a whole range of disciplines. We're not teaching them that discipline. We assume they've got that. We're giving them a heritage capstone. We're reorientating their thinking and so on. It's a different sort of approach. We've also seen this spread to other parts of the world. The United States was relatively slow in getting into this sort of approach. I mean, there are lots of courses that are based in architecture schools, as in Hawaii and Philadelphia and so on. But in the last few years, we're starting to see them at the University of Illinois, in Urbana-Champaign, and in the University of Washington, and so on. And then in Asia, at the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, and Silpakorn in Bangkok, and so on. So a new generation. We've also seen this interdisciplinary approach, this wider approach, this wider agenda coming through in conferences and in the proliferation of journals such as the IJHS, this one, and Heritage and Society and Cultural Landscape and so on. There's quite a lot around now. Of course, lots of textbooks around. I mean, there's just one that picks up two ideas, the whole disciplinary field of tourism studies and heritage studies, and tries to bring those together. It looks at the interface between these two disciplines. So this is a book that will appear later this year. Okay, so there were changes occurring. Okay. But, through the last 10 years or so, we've had a number of instances when people have actually started to talk about signs of discontent. This kind of start of a paradigm unrest, if you like, if you want to use the Kuhn idea. Okay. The Smithsonian Institute, for instance, in 2004, talked about this field as being completely under-theorized. Okay. They didn't. This was just a short-page statement, really, that had a surprising effect, despite its shortness. And it's very vague, and they don't really attempt to explain what they mean by that. What most people have taken it to mean is that you've got a whole lot of people in universities and writing in journals and running conferences with a kind of scattergun approach. Lots of things are being said, but it needs to be pulled together and given some kind of theoretical structures and so on. And all of that is wanting. And this is where Laura Jane steps in, because in 2006 she published her book called The Uses of Heritage, in which she starts to talk about, particularly focusing on archaeology, but she's starting to talk about the limits of this, and she's starting to talk about the limits of notions of heritage. And this is where she introduces the AHD, the Authorized Heritage Discourse. I'll come back to that later on. Now, I want to say something at this point about what's going on in the professional field as well. Okay, you've really got these two things, and it's a worry that these two things tend to operate rather separately, and there ought to be more connection between them. You've got what's happening in the universities, which is really where we use the term heritage studies, and what's happening out in the heritage field with the professionals, working on sites and being consultants and so on. And they really, should be talking to each other, but it's, often it's too separate. I guess you've heard of Gustavo Arraos, who's the current president of ICOMOS, an American And he wrote a paper in 2009. It was an internal paper, but you can get it on the web and elsewhere, which he presented to the ICOMOS executive at a meeting in Malta in 2009, called Protecting Heritage Places Under the New Heritage Paradigm and Defining Its Tolerance for Change. Okay? So here, just as in the universities in this case, you've also got some people in the professions starting to say, look, we've got a problem on our hands. There are all these issues, all these problems we've got out there, for which the set of ideas that are accepted in dealing with heritage aren't sufficient. We need to be doing something else. Okay? Now, he's essentially arguing that the World Heritage System and the role that ICOMOS has in the World Heritage System, and in many states around the world, has moved from a narrow focus on maintaining authenticity, okay, and outstanding universal value based on authenticity, especially as represented by fabric, a material. Okay? That's the old view that underlay the early work on monuments and sites. Okay? But now, of course, we're dealing with a much wider idea of a wider set of heritage forms, living cities, intangible values, and so on. Where authenticity is not the key issue. In fact, you'll know from your study of the Intangible Convention they don't use authenticity. They discussed it for a long time, and in the end decided this was not the relevant factor. The relevant factor is the transmission of the intangible knowledge from one generation to another, whether it's knowledge about dance or music or ritual or whatever. So the key thing is to be sure that there's a transmission from generation to generation. Okay, whereas with physical fabric, it's authenticity. Okay, so Arraios is saying then, and you'll notice that he's saying it in the past tense. For him, the paradigm has already shifted. And he goes back and says, well, we can see this coming from 1981 with the Florence Charter for the Conservation of Historic Gardens, where, of course, the trees are not the same. You have to. What you're really protecting with historic garden is the concept of the garden. The plants themselves keep dying. So you're moving away from authenticity based in fabric to something else. And then with the Charter on Built Vernacular Heritage, where in that charter it's saying the key thing, if you want to keep vernacular landscapes and vernacular heritage in the built form alive, is that you have to transmit the knowledge about how you repair buildings and maintain them from generation to generation. So it's a different approach. And then the Borough Charter, which you mentioned before. Now, perhaps Gustavo is jumping to conclusions here because there is still resistance, very vocal resistance within the ICOMOS world to Gustavo's ideas. The International Scientific Committee on Theory and Philosophy of Conservation and Restoration, for instance, is saying, no, our job is not all of that. Our job is to conserve a physical fabric. Let's stick to what we've been doing, what we know best, and so on. You can see that discussed in the Banderin, Francesco Banderin and Ron Van Eers's new book on historic urban landscape. If you look at page 199, you'll see some discussion of that resistance to the new ideas. Okay, critical heritage studies. In the universities, going back to the universities again now for a moment, some of these ideas started to coalesce in the last, 6 or 7 years around seeing what we're doing as we're seeing what we should be doing as a more critical approach, a more theoretical approach, more critical approach, more analytical approach to heritage studies, which we call critical heritage studies. And I've been involved in this myself, particularly through a series of books that you might know about. It's published by Routledge, called the Key Issues in Cultural Heritage series. And if you look at those books, you'll see that Laura Jane and I have a foreword at the beginning of each of the volumes in the series, which tries to explain what we think this series is about. And it's really trying to explain this approach to this critical heritage studies approach. So the foreword says, this series of books aims then to identify interdisciplinary debates within heritage studies and to explore how they impact on the practices, not only of heritage management conservation, but also the process of production, consumption and engagement with heritage in its many and varied forms. So you've got interdisciplinarity, you've got the much wider agenda, and you've got the idea of agency, you've got the idea of pushing things along, so we're active in the development of knowledge. So far, we have published 7 in the series, and there are another 2 about to come out. You can see halfway down the list, Heritage of War came out earlier this year. In fact, you could get it in the bookshops at the end of last year, but it's got a 2012 date on it. And most of them have 2 editors. Part of what we were doing is to have an older editor, like me, working with a younger editor. So there's kind of this transmission of skills and knowledge and so on involved. In the case of Heritage of War, there were 2 young people, one from Cottbus, Martin Gegner, he's now in Brazil, I think, isn't he? And Bart Zeno at my university. But, we got all the participants here in 2009. We had your conference, and then we had a workshop where all the participants tried their papers out, and that's now come out as Heritage of War. Children, Childhood and Cultural Heritage comes out later this year. It's the manuscript's with the publishers at the moment, and a couple of people in the presentations yesterday were talking about children and transmission of ideas to children, so you'll find that book useful. Heritage and Climate Change is the young David Harvey and Jim Fraser. That will come out next year. Heritage and Tourism is it was the one I showed you before. That's about to come out. And then we've got 2 more lined up, one on intellectual property and heritage and rights. And that's looking at the interchange between notions of traditional knowledge systems and intellectual property and copyright. These are intangible forms of heritage and how there are conflicts over those. And the other one that Laura Jane herself will probably be co-editing with somebody else on heritage, multiculturalism and diaspora. So it's looking at what happens to heritage, how it's transformed by the in-migration of people from different cultures. And that should be really interesting. Okay, but they're not the only ones. There's a book that came out again earlier this year that tries to be a critical heritage studies for Asia. It's called the Routledge Handbook of Heritage in Asia by Patrick Daly and Tim Winter. Then there's the one, the Retheorising Heritage, that Laura Jane, Helene Silverman and I are doing. That'll come out next year. And then there's another one that I'm working on with Mairead Nick Graaf, who's Irish, and Ulrich Kirkel, who is German. And that will come out in 2014. Okay? So what they're trying to do, I guess, is to capture this new flavour of heritage studies. So the books contain a variety of philosophical and methodological approaches they have a distinct political edge to them, in the sense that, you know, there is a kind of normative view. There's a view of how we would like the world to be, and, you know, how can we use scholarship to actually achieve changes that are regarded as desirable. Okay, so this is a different kind of subjectivity that's coming in. It's wanting to achieve changes in terms of inclusiveness and the accountability of heritage systems, fairness of heritage systems. Okay. So that's the kind of critical heritage studies that I'm especially interested in. I want to move on now to this issue raised by Thomas Kuhn, whether knowledge progresses by revolutions, and the opposition to that really coming from Karl Popper and other philosophers saying, no, it's more evolutionary, it's more incremental. Okay? And I want to talk about whether heritage studies is going through this revolutionary approach or whether it's an evolutionary approach. Okay? And this is where the Gutenberg Manifesto comes in. I mean, you can see, I think, just from the choice of the word manifesto, that this is much more the revolutionary idea, isn't it? And if you look at the language in it, how many of you have read the manifesto? 1, 2, not 3, 4. Is that all? Okay. Look, do get hold of it. You can get it on the web, or you can make some photocopies among yourselves. But you should have a look at it. It's really interesting. I'm going to go through and do a bit of a textual analysis on it. But start with the title, Manifesto. It's a call to arms. It's a call for revolution, probably. And here's some of the wording. It's rather long, so I've got a number of slides showing it. This document is a preliminary manifesto, a provocation, presaging the creation of this Association of Critical Heritage Studies. But it's not quite the way I would want to see critical heritage studies portrayed. It's going a bit beyond that. We want to challenge you to respond to this document and question the received wisdom of what heritage is, energise heritage studies by drawing on wider intellectual sources, vigorously question the conservative cultural and economic power relations that outdated understandings of heritage seem to underpin, and invite the active participation of people and communities who to date have been marginalised in the creation and management of the heritage. There are some sections I put in yellow because I'm going to come back to those and analyse those a bit more later on. Above all, we want you to critically engage with the proposition that heritage studies needs to be rebuilt from the ground up, which requires the ruthless criticism of everything existing. I mean, this is Maoist, really. I mean, this is Pol Pot in Cambodia, isn't it? Let's go back to year 0 and start again. Heritage is, as much as anything, a political act, and we need to ask serious questions about the power relations that heritage has all too often been invoked to sustain. Nationalism, imperialism, colonialism, cultural elitism, Western triumphalism, social exclusion based on class and ethnicity, and the fetishizing, I don't know whether that word really exists, but the fetishizing of expert knowledge have all exerted strong influences on how heritage is used, defined and managed. We argue that a truly critical heritage studies will ask many uncomfortable questions of traditional ways of thinking and doing heritage, and that the interests of the marginalised and excluded will be brought to the forefront when posing these questions. The study of heritage has historically been dominated by Western, predominantly European experts in archaeology, history, architecture and art history. Though there have been progressive currents in these disciplines, they sustain a limited idea of what heritage is and how it should be studied and managed. the old way of looking at heritage, the authorized heritage discourse, privileges the old, grand, prestigious, expert-approved sites, buildings and artefacts that sustain Western narratives of nation, class and science. There is now enough sustained dissatisfaction, paradigm unrest, with this way of thinking about heritage that its critics can feel confident in coming together to form an international organisation to promote a new way of thinking about doing heritage, the Association of Critical Heritage Studies. In doing so, the conference and the association can build on and promote existing critical innovations and interventions in heritage. Okay. There's some really interesting contradictions in this. I mean, the idea that you might sweep everything away is an anti-heritage position to start with. I mean, heritage is about, keeping things from the past that are still of value, and so there's some really interesting ideas in it. What does this require? It goes on, and here you've got a whole list of things. I better not dwell on all of this because I'll clearly run out of time. But the yellow bits, an opening up to a wider range of intellectual traditions. The social sciences, sociology, anthropology, political science, amongst others, need to be drawn on to provide theoretical insights and techniques to study heritage. Democratizing heritage by consciously rejecting elite cultural narratives and embracing the heritage of insights of people, communities and cultures that have traditionally been marginalised in formulating heritage policy. And the next bit, making critical heritage studies truly international through the synergy of taking seriously diverse non-Western cultural traditions. Okay, I'm going to pick just about 4 of these key ideas in yellow there. The one about the authorized heritage discourse. And we started talking about that, or I started talking with you about this yesterday, and you've been talking all the course, I'm sure, about it. The old way of looking at heritage privileges the old, the grand, the prestigious, the expert. Now, the point I made yesterday was that giving something like this a nice little title, that can be turned into an acronym, the AHD, has really made it very popular, and there are lots of students now using it, and I think sometimes in a not very critical way. In fact, an American scholar wrote to Laura Jane and I recently about this, in fact proposing a volume in the Key Issues series where she refers to the AHD as being hegemonic. It's starting to take on, this role. I mean, this is the paradigm idea coming through. But Catherine is one of the people who's resisting that paradigm. Political and ideological uses of heritage, picking up that little bit in the yellow. What I guess in a nutshell, I've abandoned my notes, you can see, because it'll be quicker if I just stick to the slides. What I'm saying really about these is that the horse has already bolted on a lot of this. This is a bit out of date. It's a long time since heritage systems in many countries, and even at the global level, abandoned that elitist view of what heritage is. Nationally as well. Not all nations, of course, but in some. I mean, I'm on the Victorian Heritage Council, and we started off back in the 1960s taking on a list that had been drawn up by an NGO, the National Trust, and it was a list that had been drawn up by Lady May Casey, the wife of the Governor-General, and some architects in the 1950s who simply put on a list the things that they liked, and that most of these things were the big old buildings from the 19th century, and that became the start of the Victorian Heritage Register. But since the 1960s, we've been filling this out with thematic studies of one kind and another. So now you have bridges and schools, and we've just finished a study on immigrant heritage, and so it's a long time since we were using an authorised heritage discourse of that kind. Of course, what we're doing in the Heritage Council of Victoria is authorising another set of buildings, but it's not all top-down. I mean, it's not all professionally dominated. A lot of it comes from underneath. We use techniques like cultural mapping, for instance, meetings with community groups. I've been out in the country running meetings with the little amateur museums that are all around the country where people have been collecting things and getting them to explain to us what they think is important. And, so you're getting a mix of things. Some stuff coming, of course, from on top, where we get a consultant in to do a thematic study or something or other, but a lot of it's coming from underneath. So it's much more a mix of things than this idea of authorised heritage discourse suggests. In terms of the political and ideological uses of heritage, in that yellow bit, there are lots of studies around now that look at this. I mean, your paper yesterday was terrific on how China uses heritage in a very political way. I wrote a book on Hanoi back in 2000. I collected material for about 10 years. Eventually, the book came out in 2000. Published in the US and Australia and Singapore, and it then was picked up in 2010 when Hanoi came to its 1000th birthday. They decided they would reprint 100 books on Hanoi as part of that celebration. So my book was the only foreigners book. I was really pleased about this. It was the only foreigners book that was included, and it got translated into Vietnamese, so at last they could read it in their own language. But that's all about, the way in which successive regimes in Vietnam, Chinese, the independent Vietnamese of various kinds, the French, then the communists under Ho Chi Minh and his followers, where they were part of the Soviet bloc. And, each time you get a change of regime, they redefine the heritage. And they start to try and rebuild the nation, the way they want. I mean, all countries, Australia does this. I mean, every time we get a change of government, you get a different way of using the heritage. We had a conservative government for a while under John Howard who used this very strongly. In fact, he insisted on changing the school syllabuses in history and, to make them, make people learn to be more Australian in the way he thought Australians should be. And, okay, so this is really not new. So again, I'm saying I agree entirely with what Laura Jane is saying in the manifesto on that point, except that it's already well on the way. Community engagement, she talks about. We need to get the people who have been on the margins back in. Well, of course we do. But this is not a new idea. Now look what's been happening in the World Heritage System. You know about this. You know that in Budapest, in the World Heritage Session in Budapest in 2002, there was this great emphasis on getting the message out, getting communities involved, giving them information about it, getting their views into it. So they added the fourth C for communication, 2002. Very important conference in 2003 in Amsterdam, linking local and global values, where they're particularly interested in Indigenous issues and traditional knowledge systems and traditional management systems. But, they're really saying there that it's imperative that the values and practices of local communities, together with traditional management systems, are fully understood, respected, encouraged and accommodated in management plans if the heritage resources are to be sustained in the future. This is standard now. It's in the operational guidelines and everywhere else. That's 2003, and, ended up as being World Heritage Papers number 13. Then the World Heritage Committee meeting in 2007 in New Zealand where they added the fifth C, which is C for community. So already, you see, I mean, this call in the manifesto is too late. I mean, it's good to keep saying it, I guess, but it's already well on the way, even in this global system. And, we're using these different techniques of getting a bottom-up approach. The Borough Charter, if you've ever looked at that, one of the key issues in it is to use social value, that things can be important because of their social significance. It's a highly problematic, for us still, criterion, but we do use it. It's difficult, of course, because all things have social value to some people, and it's a bit difficult to say, well, your social value is more important than yours. And I mean, it is a fairly tricky one to do. It's a bit like criterion number 6. In the World Heritage System, it's easier if you can say, well, it's social value, but it's also aesthetic, or it's also scientific value, or whatever. Okay, but the point is, we're no longer saying that only the experts know what heritage is. Heritage these days is much more inclusive. It has been democratised in many countries. Western triumphalism takes seriously, the manifesto says, diverse non-Western cultural heritage tradition. Of course. And, Western triumphalism really ended with the Nara document in 1994, and with the global strategy in 1994, where you're starting to get different ways, non-Western ways. The Nara document now is standard around the world. It's had enormous influence, right through and then reinforced by the Intangible Convention in 2003. Another book that you'll be interested to see coming out later this year by Zeynep Egan, who's a Turkish academic. She's working at the University of Southampton, I think it is, in the UK. And her book is an interesting one. If I just find my notes. She asked me very kindly to write the foreword to it. What she is really saying is that we're still having this shift. We talk a lot about this century being the Asian century. There's a move of the centre of power away from Europe, probably away from North America to Asia. And she's saying, well, this eventually will flow through into all sorts of aspects of life, including heritage. And so the basic premise of her book is saying, well, if this is going to happen, we need to know more about what's happening in these other lesser-known places, like Turkey and Asia and South America and Africa and so on. So the book, I think, will help shift the balance, but it's again showing that we've moved away, or we're moving away from the Western triumphalism approach. Then there's a whole lot of work that's been going on in terms of Indigenous heritage. The issues of indigeneity, the idea of holistic heritage. Aboriginal people in Australia make no distinction between natural and cultural at all. That's totally foreign to them. It's very difficult then to, and they don't see intangible as being separate from tangible either. So it's very difficult to use existing laws, that are Western to capture all that. But we're coming there. I suspect when I get home next week, I'll find that the Indigenous Heritage Council and the council I'm on will have been merged, which will be a fantastic step forward. I'm hoping that that's what's going on at the moment. Then, this idea of development, environment sustainability that the manifesto refers to. Again, a lot of this is not new. One of the advantages of being old, like me, is, you know, you can see these things. You can see where things have happened before. You know, back in the 1960s, we talked about zero population growth, ZPG. Many of the people I knew limited the number of children to 2, you know, because they believed in ZPG. That's gone now, but it happened then. There were books like Alvin Toffler's Future Shock that talked about what's the impact of constant, rapid change on people's psyche. You know, there was the notion of planet Earth, you know, spaceship Earth, a contained organism. Yeah. You know, this is not new. The 60s and 70s had a whole lot of neighbourhood planning stuff. A lot of work done by geographers and others on amenity as a factor in locational choice of residences and industries and so on. You can see this coming through in the World Heritage reports. Have a look at the report in 2010, the Brasilia meeting on sustainable heritage and sustainability, especially the Annex 1, which is just a page, but it proposes a kind of rough methodology for integrating sustainable development into heritage planning. And then you've got, you know, the whole movement towards historic urban landscape. And so again, there's a long story going on. Okay? Again, so what I'm saying is, from my point of view, it seems to be much more evolutionary rather than revolutionary. You know, sure, there are moments when things become hot topics and, you know, new agendas and so on, but it seems to me there is as much evolution as there is this idea of unrest and a revolutionary change. Okay, so, I mean, if all of that is true, you know, everything's has been going on for a long time, what then is new, if anything? And here's a chance to just highlight a few things. Again, these have all got their antecedents. You know, if you do your literature reviews, you will find that these are already fairly well grounded. But these seem to me to be the key things that we, at this moment in time, are fascinated by. These are the hot topics. So one of them is heritage and dialogue. You know, how can we use heritage as a way of getting dialogue between different people of different cultures and, you know, different backgrounds together. And okay, this is essential really to all of what UNESCO does. You know, going back to the Constitution that Mike Turner referred to yesterday. You know, Huxley's words in the preamble. You know, since wars begin in the minds of men, it's in the minds of men that the defences of peace must be constructed. I mean, this is essential. You know, and my criticism of UNESCO, I'm a UNESCO chair, but, you know, UNESCO is such a big organisation and inefficient that they haven't actually caught up with me yet. But, you know, I'm fairly critical that much of what UNESCO does has forgotten that. You know, all this stuff to do with heritage sites for tourism and all the rest. You know, we're not there to support the tourism industry. We can use the tourism industry if it helps us, but, you know, it has to be carefully managed. You know, this is what we're on about. And this is what the new DG, Irina Bokova, is strong on. And, you know, I hope what she is trying to push comes to some kind of fruition. 2010, you know, while UNESCO has several mandates, it has but one mission, that of constructing peace. Okay, so, you know, what that means in practice, I think, is that there are certain kinds of programs that UNESCO should be prioritising. And in the World Heritage System, it should be also prioritising things that encourage dialogue, like transboundary nominations. Extremely difficult to do. But, you know, get the Chinese and the North Koreans together to deal with them, you know, the tombs that they've got in Kogoro and so on. Very difficult, but important. We should be, I think, these days asking in nomination files that there is an interpretation plan included, and the interpretation plan should be evaluated to ensure that it is cross-culturally sensitive. Okay? Too much of what happens in the World Heritage System is about nations boasting their own heritage. That's not what it should be. It should be about understanding other people's heritage and building respect and tolerance and peace in that way. Another area is this whole issue of rights, but I would add to that responsibilities. It's not just one-sided. It's not just, what's our rights in this. It's also what are our responsibilities to others, to the environment, and so on. Okay, a lot of work being done on this. The Silverman and Fairchild book, which is called Heritage and Human Rights, I think, 2007. A book called Cultural Diversity, Heritage and Human Rights in the Key Issues series, 2010. There was a very important workshop in Oslo last year on trying to find ways to establish a human rights basis to the management of World Heritage Sites. That has led on to meetings with ICOMOS, and the next ICOMOS General Assembly will have heritage and human rights as its main theme, I understand. And the papers from that have come out now in the last issue, the May issue of the International Journal of Heritage Studies, so you can read them there. Meanwhile, at the Human Rights Commission in Geneva, there is a Pakistani woman sociologist by the name of Farida Shahid, who's been working on cultural rights. She's been appointed for 3 years, but last year she particularly focused on heritage and the rights issues to do with heritage. So you can find her material again on the web. These are all in the reference list that's attached to my paper. And then another area that I'm interested in too is the idea that heritage has limits. That we actually expect too much of this notion, and we expect too much of UNESCO. They can't do everything. We need to put some boundaries, I think, around this notion. There are certain things from the past that we probably ought not to try and protect. Okay? Some of those are defined by human rights, of course. But if you go to Cambodia, there are now sites related to Pol Pot that are starting to become cult sites. And one of my colleagues, Colin Long, wrote a paper with Keir Reeves where he's arguing that we should protect things to do with the victims of genocide, the Auschwitz and so on. We learn important lessons from that. But they're arguing that we shouldn't protect things, the heritage belonging to the perpetrators. So he was arguing in the case of Pol Pot, that we shouldn't protect Pol Pot's grave because all it's doing is attracting, this cult around it. So, I'm at the moment exploring these notions of, what are the limits that you might put around, what would be the criteria? How would you try and limit it? There is, of course, other kinds of limits. The World Heritage List is now up around 1,000. Is that a limit? Have we now picked up the things that are of universal value? Are we now starting to get things that are really only national value? Is there a limit there? So, just finally then, last minute here. I guess what I'm arguing is that there's so much evolution, that I'm not sure the paradigm really works quite as well as some people think it might, and they tending to use the term in this kind of popular way rather than anything like the way that Thomas Kuhn and Popper and the philosophers think about. In any case, I would say the jury is probably still out. Either what we've got at the moment is just a very long period of paradigm unrest and eventually everybody will come around, okay? Or what's happening is, that it's much more evolutionary. What Johnson has found looking at geography is that there is a growing plurality of approaches and ideas and views. I think that's a good thing. That's what I would like. I don't want to close things off with manifestos that become hegemonic in their own way. That's my view of critical heritage studies is wide. There is a problem here that I'll just draw your attention to. I mentioned it earlier. You know, this idea that you've got the profession out there and the universities here in their ivory tower, you know, doing nice scholarly things, perhaps understanding situations quite clearly, but not making much effort to influence practice out in the field. And the same way around, there are a lot of practitioners who never read a journal or go to a conference and, you know, don't think that they can learn much from the scholar. I think we need to keep these together in a critical heritage studies. Certainly we can say there is a new agenda, even if it's not a new paradigm. Okay, now just to go back, last word on the manifesto. You know, it's intended to be a provocation. And I think it has. It certainly provoked me. I think the debate needs to continue on. So thank you very much. That's all I have to say.